This episode of the Game OverThinker is brought to you by the letters A and B, and by Japan. Japan. If you can imagine it, we can imagine it being fucked by an octopus.
Let me hit you with a name you could almost never expect to hear in a piece about video games. Carl Gustav Jung. Born July 26, 1875, died June 6, 1961, founder of the field of analytical psychology and probably the second most famous psychiatrist in history after his mentor, collaborator, and eventual rival, Sigmund Freud. Jung's greatest contribution to 20th century thought was likely his theory of the collective unconscious, a brilliant postulation which I will now proceed to butcher in the interest of brevity. Basically, the collective unconscious could be said to start from the premise that the majority of human brains all have the same basic plumbing, just with different material, i.e. life experiences running through them for each individual person. So imagine a fear pipe, a love pipe, etc. We all get the same pipes, we all run different stuff through them, and that's how individual fears, loves, whatever take shape. In other words, the guy who's afraid of zombies and the guy who's afraid of bunnies are really both scared of the same basic primal abstract force, they've just poured different costumes for it through their individual pipes. On this point, Freud and Jung would have basically agreed. However, Jung went a step deeper and theorized that because people in a society or civilization tend to share similar life experiences, they also end up sharing similar unconscious reactions to them, and that these shared reactions form the basis of each society's unique set of myths, legends, religious beliefs, and what have you. Therefore, just as Zombie Guy and Bunny Guy are basically having the same nightmare, the society that worshipped the cow god and the society that worshipped the bird god were basically generating the same myth just with a different gimmick. Or, put in an even more bastardized compact form, on a broad enough chart, your dreams are my dreams are everyone's dreams. Now then, what does the man currently spinning in his grave at my grotesque oversimplification of his life's work have to do with video games? Well, actually, quite a bit here and there. You may recall that the hub world in Psychonauts was called the Collective Unconscious. It also turns up in the Xenosaga games, and Jung himself got name-dropped in Eternal Darkness. Perhaps most strangely, he's actually supposed to have been quoted in, of all things, Skater Die 2. Or so I'm told. I never actually played Skater Die 2. But might he have anything more substantial to do with our little hobby here? Well, listen on, friends. You know, someone once asked me to explain precisely what it was that identified a person as a geek in the modern parlance. Actually doing so proved difficult, but ultimately this is what I came up with. The geek is someone who paradoxically derives fun from taking an activity that is already designed to be fun, like a hobby, and turning it into an activity that is not fun, like a job or a religion. For example, everyone likes to get stuff that they like. The geek collects stuff that he likes, and stuff that he doesn't like, or only kinda likes, because it's all connected somehow. Everyone likes to relax and watch movies. Movie geeks like to watch movies in epic-length marathon festivals as part of a Red Bull-fueled endurance test. And video games? Well, we all enjoy playing video games as a hobby, but video game geeks enjoy turning them into a competitive sport. Oh, and guys, before we get our panties in a bunch about me picking on geeks, let me just remind you that I am one, and that all those activities I just described are pretty much my own as well. Now, the dilemma that faces both geeks and the industries that profit from geeks is that these behaviors have become somewhat difficult to sustain a rooting interest in over time. Eventually, real-world concerns start to pile up, and sooner or later it begins to dawn on one that while assembling the entire pre-crisis DC universe in uniform-scale action figure form makes for a fine distraction, at the end of the day, maybe it really is just so much painted plastic, and perhaps your money would be better spent on, say, food. Enter continuity. Imposing a broad, continuing, interconnected narrative onto a franchise or series is the ultimate justification for our harmless, obsessive behavior. See, I'm not just collecting every issue of Spider-Man, even the shitty ones, because I'm obsessed. I need to know them all to keep the continuity straight. Does that sound like you? Because it sounds like me. Just like every other odd facet of geek culture, continuity mongering started out in the comics and the pulps, but eventually exploded into all facets during the 1980s, when even action figures suddenly needed backstories and good versus evil factionalization. Some would offer that this is all part of what was then the previously unheard-of successive influence of Star Wars, which counts among its many ripple effects the introduction of every Hollywood and marketing pitchman to the theories of Joseph Campbell. Joseph who? Don't worry, we're definitely coming back to him. So, of course, it got into video games. Sort of. Truth is, the concept of video games telling complete stories is a pretty new thing. The first games didn't have stories, and the games of the 1980s golden age were usually just prolonged third acts, with the first and second being contained entirely in the instruction manual, if it was anywhere at all. Either way, they were seldom very complex. Let's face it, all the Mega Man games are essentially telling the same story with the same structure over and over again. Back then, if we wanted to form an emotional connection to a gaming narrative, we had to fill in the gaps ourselves, and even then, we often did so under the vague awareness that many games had an entirely different story in their native Japan or in the arcades. For example, in the arcade Double Dragon, Billy and Jimmy Lee are both good guys in two-player co-op. If you beat the game with two players, it ends like something out of a Tucker Max story. Both players have to fight to determine who wins the girl. On the NES version, programming limitations prevented two-player co-op, so they preserved that original mirror match ending by changing the story so that Jimmy was evil and served as the final boss. Undaunted, we soldiered on, grabbing up any shred of narrative detail we could from any strand of gaming lore we could find to form continuities worth obsessing over. Case in point, despite there being almost no in-game mentions of continuity and only one in-game mention of extra-universal origins, most Nintendo fans of my generation went through the 80s and a big chunk of the 90s firmly accepting that the Mario Brothers were transported to the Mushroom Kingdom from Brooklyn and that games 1, 2, 3, and World all took place in sequence. Acting with slightly more solid evidence, we also quote-unquote knew that the three console Zelda titles took place in the order of 3, then 1, then 2. Yes, Zelda. In the annals of attempted to affix continuity to games from the era where narrative was strictly a suggestion, trying to line up a cohesive unifying timeline for Nintendo's sprawling Legend of Zelda franchise is something akin to the Holy Grail. There's just something about this gentle tale of a boy, a girl, and a man, who is sometimes also a pig, that turns even the most firmly grounded continuity file into fucking Robert Langdon. To be fair, the Zelda game's sense of storytelling almost seems like a deliberate tease. Each game, save for the handful of direct sequels, tends to have its own fairly dense self-contained story, and each story seems to recycle the same variation of the same character over and over again with slight variation. But there are also characters and elements that traverse the stories and hints of a broader unifying mythology in the background. Now, I'm not going to run through Zelda continuity theories with you because, frankly, the web is full of them. In fact, that's kind of what brings me before you now. See, about 6 months ago, a devoted fan posted to YouTube a frighteningly comprehensive video in support of what Zelda fans call the split timeline theory, which essentially postulates that the time travel shenanigans of Ocarina of Time created two separate continuities and thus explained most of the apparent story fractures. He sent the video to Nintendo, hoping to find out if he'd come close to cracking what he assumed was a code, only to receive what appeared to be a form letter explaining that according to the guys in charge, there is no continuity, that except for the direct sequels, every game is an entirely new story using familiar elements. The video maker was not happy, and lots of hardcore Nintendo fans were not happy right along with him. Now then, do people who are seriously hung up on whether or not Zelda has a single story need to get a life? Yes. Yes, they probably do. But I can't say I don't understand where their frustration is coming from. Look, only the most deluded gamer isn't aware that at least on some level, we spend a lot of time replaying the same games again and again, with only the graphics and gameplay genuinely evolving over each console generation. Continuity, the illusion that these recurring games are actually forming the arc of a single bigger narrative, is vital to helping us ignore this fact. Plus, there's those instances when a game actually does make an emotional impact. The story of Ocarina, with its melancholy reflections on nostalgia, the end of childhood, and the uncertainty of the future, came out right at the point that much of Generation NES was suffering through high school and watching the face of gaming change irrevocably around them, and as such cut a deep gash into the emotional psyche of many fans. The idea that that particular Link and Zelda's story doesn't in some way continue on into Wind Waker almost makes it seem as if Nintendo is telling them that the narrative they so connected to somehow doesn't matter. I ask myself, can I offer any insight that'll make those Zelda fans feel better? Well, no, I can't. But I know who can. Meet Joseph Campbell. Born March 26, 1904, died on Halloween 1987. An expert on world mythology, Campbell dedicated his life to seeking nothing less than a single underlying connection between all of human spirituality and imagination. To that end, he was greatly influenced by everyone from James Joyce to Friedrich Nietzsche to James Frazer, but in particular, he drew greatly from the ideas of our good buddy from earlier, Carl Jung. You'll recall that Jung's theory of the collective unconscious held that the similar dreams and fantasies of individuals within a society were the basis from whence came the mythology or religion of a society. Campbell extrapolated from this that since human beings and thus human brains hadn't changed much on a strictly biological level between ancient Sumer and now, that all of the various myths and legends and religions of all the civilizations throughout history were actually all the same set of stories being told and told over again because on some deep unconscious level, human beings need these particular stories to inspire and direct them. Borrowing a term from James Joyce, Campbell would call this the monomyth, and later expand on it in his landmark book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. To once again grossly oversimplify the work of an intellectual giant, the basic idea here is that if you break them down into the barest possible outline, all the great heroic legends are the same. Put another way, Gilgamesh, Hercules, Moses, Jesus, King Arthur, Superman, Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, all the same basic guy. So you see, folks, looked at from a certain Jungian perspective, the repetitious rather than continuous nature of franchises like The Legend of Zelda can be considered part of a truly grand literary and indeed human storytelling tradition. Perhaps, just as every civilization needs to retell its own version of Campbell's heroic journey myth, successive gamer and console generations need to re-experience the Zelda story, and not just in the more obvious mythological parallels. Perhaps we need, on a deep unconscious level, for these stories, these legends of the boy, the girl, the Triforce, the Master Sword, and the man who is sometimes also a pig, to be with us no matter how much the graphics and the processors and the gameplay change. Perhaps the truly great stories, the ones that really matter, aren't the ones that go on forever, but the ones that get retold forever. Or perhaps I'm overthinking things.